Okay, I am going to get us started. Once again, welcome. I am Jeff Moore. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Independent Sector, and it is our great honor and joy to welcome you all to today's webinar to talk about a topic that is, I suspect, close to each of us, the topic of nonprofit advocacy. Perhaps never more important to be talking about this very issue than in this time. I wanted to just provide a little bit of context from an independent sector perspective before then asking each of our speakers to introduce themselves. And then I will see you on the back end of the webinar to kind of close us out. The first thing that I want to say is that I believe it is true for all of us on this call and really for all of us in the nonprofit sector space, in the charitable nonprofit sector space, that at the end of the day, in some way, shape, or form, each of us is working through our various missions to make sure that all people in this country are thriving, that they are thriving in a flourishing democracy and a robust civil society. And we know that the charitable nonprofit sector plays an incredibly important role in making sure, as a whole, that we are moving the nation in that direction. There is still a lot of work to be done in that regard, of course, but the role, the contribution, the voice of our sector in that work is essential. Therefore, we know our sector, in order to do that work, has to be healthy, it has to be trusted, and it has to be moving through the world in ways that are advancing equitable practice within our own space and equitable outcomes in the communities that we serve. So that begs a question: what does it look like for nonprofits, in fact, to be healthy? And about 6 years ago, we introduced a framework. It's not the only framework that exists in the world to help us think about the health of the nonprofit sector, but it is our framework. And you can think of it as sort of a diagnostic with 4 specific lenses, right? So there are 4 things that we want to see in the world and that as independent sector, we measure, right, and then report on annually in the fall in our Health of the U.S. Nonprofit Sector report. Those lenses are, or the things we want to see as true in the world of nonprofits are, we want to make sure that nonprofits are financially robust, they are financially healthy. And we're talking about both grant making and grant seeking organizations. Number 2, we want to make sure that those same nonprofits are powered by a thriving workforce. That's clearly a place where we have some work to do and subject of other webinars. We want to make sure that nonprofits are trusted and that they are well governed and that they are effective in the work that they do. And then 4th and finally, and the topic of today's webinar, is we want to make certain that nonprofits, charities, and foundations, to the extent allowed by law, are informed and active advocates in the public policy space. So the point of saying all of that is advocacy is a measure of health for our sector. That's what we're here to talk about today. And so I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to ask our speakers each to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Heather.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather MacIndoe. I am an associate professor of public policy at the McCormick Graduate School for Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I teach and research on nonprofit advocacy and on philanthropy.
Hector.
Hi, everyone. My name is Héctor Malvido. I'm with Building Movement Projects, and I'm the Senior Manager of Partnerships. My biggest sort of scope of work revolves around the service and social change work, in which we support human services or direct service organizations explore and engage with the concepts of advocacy and sort of big social change work that they can do in their communities.
Thanks, Hector. Kristin?
Thank you for having me. My name is Kristin Hurdle, and I'm the Senior Director of State Government Relations for YMCA of the USA. And my job is helping build the capacity at the local and state level of Ys to be the most effective, engaged advocates that they can be. So in a way, I'm an advocate for advocacy within the Y movement.
Thanks, all three. And Kevin, please.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Research at Independent Sector. I'm here to moderate this panel of amazing guests, so we're thrilled to have you all. I also want to take us through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with our conversation. First off, this webinar is being recorded. The goal is for it to be a continuing resource for folks who weren't able to be here. Audience names aren't part of that recording, and when we answer questions verbally, we're not going to share your names or organizations. So it is possible to submit questions anonymously, but you also don't need to, so up to you. We do want to encourage you to ask questions as we go. We're going to effectively end up having a pause for audience questions about halfway through, and then another longer period for audience questions as we get near the end of the webinar. So we should have plenty of time for your questions. So again, please keep ask them whenever you have them. That is, I think, what you need to know. We're going to start with some discussion about the report that we're focusing on today, which is The Pursuit of Influence. Heather was the lead author of that report, and she's going to talk a little bit about that report before we start talking to the panel.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So I'm very excited to share this research with you today, and I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on the report, Murray Kim of George Mason University, Louis Falk of American University, and Claire Conacher of the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The starting point for this research was the Public Engagement Nonprofit Survey, or PENS, which was funded by IS and professionally administered in 2022. In that project, we found that only 31% of nonprofits nationally reported engaging in advocacy or lobbying in the previous 5 years. This represents a decline from 20 years ago, which was the last time a national nonprofit survey was conducted. At that time, 74% of nonprofits reported engaging in lobbying. So to better understand this decline in advocacy, along with other related topics, we conducted 40 interviews with nonprofit executive directors nationally who had participated in the PENS survey and agreed to a future interview. These nonprofits were located across the United States, and they varied by whether they reported their advocacy in the previous 5 years as having stayed the same or having increased. The nonprofits also varied by size and age, and we included nonprofits in locations in red, blue, and purple states. I'd like to highlight 3 findings from the report: how nonprofits understand and speak about advocacy, the barriers they identified and how they address them, and the challenges of working in a hyper-partisan political landscape. With respect to how nonprofits defined advocacy, some nonprofit leaders spoke about advocacy very broadly to encompass everything from service provision to troubleshooting issues for individual clients. Most nonprofit directors did define advocacy as mission-based work that gave voice to their organization and to the people that they are working for. Other nonprofits defined advocacy as policy advocacy or lobbying, specifically engaging with elected representatives and with others in positions of power to represent their clients, for example, by protecting funding or influencing legislation. And several leaders spoke about how they try very hard not to use the word advocacy or lobbying for fear of upsetting some organizational constituency. Turning to barriers to advocacy, It's no surprise that many nonprofit leaders talked about barriers to advocacy, and the biggest ones they spoke about were time, money, and staff to conduct effective policy advocacy. Leaders also spoke about the need to engage expertise on some forms of advocacy. Executive directors did speak about the ways they work to overcome some of these barriers. These included working with others in nonprofit coalitions and mobilizing their boards of directors in support of their advocacy. The final set of findings I would highlight is how nonprofit leaders talked about the challenges of their work and their advocacy in hyper-partisan political environments. Many nonprofit leaders talked about the strategic necessity of maintaining a nonpartisan or bipartisan stance in their work and in their advocacy. Some shared that the increasingly polarized political landscape is a distraction to their work. One leader described herself as tying herself in knots so as not to offend anyone. Their board members, their clients, their donors, or government officials themselves. Finally, leaders talked about how political polarization creates unpredictability for their organizations, where they could be one social media post away from creating an unintended political situation. The research report is available on the research section of the IS website, and it provides much more detail about these and other themes that emerged from our conversations with nonprofit leaders. And if you are one of those leaders and you are on the call today, thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather. So yeah, we're going to dive into some questions for the panel. Again, if you have questions for the panel, please share them, and we'll have time to get to audience Q&A. So Heather, the first question is for you, specifically about the research report. One of the things that jumped out at me that I thought was most interesting and that I really loved was the idea of organizational mission as North Star, right, for how these organizations approach advocacy. Can you share examples or details from those interviews of how orienting around mission works for these organizations?
Sure. As you mentioned, this theme of advocacy as a North Star came up several times in our discussions, and I'll just touch on a few examples. For example, there was an executive director of a California human service organization who talked about how they have many more opportunities to engage in advocacy than they can possibly address, and that they need to be very selective and center their advocacy around their mission. So she talked about saying, that's a bit off target, but thanks for thinking of us. There was another nonprofit leader working in the area of immigrant services who talked about focusing on their mission while reflecting on what's going on in the world, but really thinking locally about what they could realistically do in their corner of the world. And this was a theme that came up several times, nonprofits talking about staying in their lane. Several nonprofits use some variant of this phrase, and what they meant by that is really leaning into their particular areas of expertise and being really focused on their mission and for it to drive their advocacy.
Thank you. Héctor, Building Movement Project has what I think is a really impressive program where you work with direct service nonprofits who want to get more involved in systems change. How do those people in those organizations talk about advocacy, and does it line up with what you saw in our report?
Yes, it lines up really well with what's on the report. I think that was actually what was the most interesting part, right? Is folks are coming at the word advocacy in many different ways, right? They're defining it as, as Heather was saying, as policy changes. Some are defining it as what they do on a daily basis for the people they work with. And it's sort of like this big word that influences a lot of like what the decisions are to engage with it altogether. One of the biggest questions that we ask in our sort of spaces are in our learning spaces with the different service organizations, like how does advocacy show up for the different stakeholders that you have within your organization, not external stakeholders, but internally, right? Like that includes your board, that includes your frontline staff, that includes your clients, your volunteers. What comes up for people when you're talking about sort of systems change, or even like having a discussion around root cause analysis? And as Heather was saying in the report, all of it sort of, people are in this space and working within this organization because they believe in the mission. And a big part of why advocacy ties really well together with the mission, and why it should, is because it shouldn't deviate too far from what people already do on a daily basis, what they're experts at, what they're really knowledgeable about, the different gaps that they see on every day as they do the work. But it also, within this sort of spectrum of advocacy, right? It can bolster what they do on a daily basis. That could be either those, this big spectrum of social change, right? Where it could be these big, sexy battles at the city council or at the county board of supervisors, where we're sort of thinking about, oh, like all these organizations, they showed up and it was like this big hurrah and press conference. And when people think about advocacy in that way, it might seem a little daunting and a little far away from what they do. But when you look at it as a spectrum, and you're able to see like, what are the different ways that we can influence social change that sit within the strengths of ourselves as an organization, is when people start, the organizations that we work with start sort of visioning themselves as social change agents, far better than they were if like they just, again, they see it as this big hurrah of what social change they think it looks like.
Hey, thanks. That's yeah. As someone who's been to a lot of city council meetings at various points in my career, I know they can indeed be big, sexy battles. So I can see where that would be intimidating for a lot of people to get involved in. So one thing that has really stood out to me, right, is this idea of how we talk about advocacy amongst ourselves, amongst our communities, with policymakers, maybe strategically varying how we talk about it, right, depending on what our audience is. Heather mentioned that sometimes organizations avoid the word advocacy entirely, right, because they are concerned that it will turn someone off. I wanted to ask the whole panel about shared vocabulary. So what are opportunities to strengthen our work, again, by approaching this question of vocabulary, or how we talk about or how we communicate about advocacy? Like, how do we use that to our advantage?
Well, I think the way that it manifested in our discussions with nonprofit leaders is a lot of them talked about education to various different constituencies. And they were using education as a synonym for advocacy. As they mentioned, they were uncomfortable using advocacy, using lobbying, but they were comfortable saying, we'd like to educate you on this issue. And they use that term both internally and externally, which was very interesting.
I can add from the why perspective. I mean, one of the strengths of all of our whys is we've got whys on every end of the continuum of advocacy, capacity, sophistication. And I think when we talk about barriers, and sometimes it's the time, it's the intimidation. I think for us, because we do use education quite a bit in our work, I see it as taking down some of the barriers. So we're not asking whys to do something else in addition, to find extra time to do something. It's like, you're doing this great work. Part of that great work is education to community leaders and policymakers, to your board of volunteers. So that's how we've been using education, and it's, tell people about the community impact that you're making, which is then the next building block is really, advocacy and more, specific calls to action on specific, pieces of policy that might be moving. So I think education for us is this almost like this great entry point to get, our staff and volunteers engaged.
Just really quickly, I think that when we're thinking about the word advocacy, that is just one of the ways that social change happens. And I think the way what Kristin and Heather were bringing up around education is also one of the other ways. There's other ways like networking, traditional organizing. I mean, you can also have electoral politics, and all of those have their own sort of segues or lanes that different service providers can engage in their own way. That makes sense. But even with sort of let's say we have an understanding of what the word advocacy means, I think service providers really have to have an internal discussion about what are their social change goals? What are their social change priorities, right? Like, what do they want to see at the end of this road if they want to engage in advocacy? And in what way you carry out, building that list of social change priorities that's tied to your theory of social change, why your services are needed and how you're funded and what are your sort of measures for impact and all that good stuff. When you are able to sort of build it from the ground up in that way, and you bring along your stakeholders, you have this buy-in that, the words start feeling a little less scary because you have this vision of, what you can get towards with social change work. And again, advocacy is something that direct service providers do every day, like as was said in the report. And I think that is probably the strongest case for how service organizations can really make change happen, is because for instance, if you're a case manager working in housing or with people who are experiencing homelessness, you really have to be hustling, and you're networking and you're educating and you're already doing all of these things as a service provider. So it's just adding this twist of, okay, let's do what we do best, but gear it towards sort of this vision of social change that we can see through this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll echo that, Hector. That's exactly what we're seeing with the why. So I mentioned our community impact and that sort of education to the external audience, to our why movement, but the education internally, to Hector's point that, whys are like all nonprofits being asked to do more with less, it feels like. And the education that it's not just your right as a nonprofit, but also your responsibility. And it's an integral part of the mission that as frontline service providers, you can see those community needs, help solve those critical social issues, and policymakers want and need to hear from you. And it's your responsibility to share what you're learning from those front lines. So it's the education externally, but also internally.
A great segue to my next question, which was about internal dynamics, specifically around boards. So Heather, I know in the report, there's some mentions of mobilizing organizational boards, and Hector, you brought up boards as well. Starting with Heather, but Kristin and Hector, if you want to chime in, like what do we know about how to get boards involved, and and the role they play in mobilizing organizations and supporting this kind of work?
Sure. This came up several times in our discussion, many times in our discussion with nonprofit leaders. And it's interesting that we just talked about education, because that's where the discussion often began. There was one man who told us about the trajectory of his career in his organization, how he came in. It was all about getting things in shape financially, making sure that things were running on time. And then he talked about how over time he brought his board along with respect to advocacy, and he actually educated them a great deal about the importance of it to their organization, to their funding flows, to their clients. So that was one of the themes that came up, this idea of your board is there for you, and part of how they can be valuable to you is for you to educate them about how you need them to be involved in advocacy. The second thing that came up, the second and third things that came up, had to do with board members being involved in advocacy in two ways, one of which was strategically leading initiatives for the organization. So that's kind of an internal function that boards played. The second way that board involvement in advocacy came up is directly doing it themselves on behalf of the organization. And there was a woman who talked to us about how she could get on the phone and call up her board member and she would know the mayor or she would know the council person and be able to either herself go and have the conversation or put the executive director, give that introduction and that legitimacy to her to speak on behalf of her organization. So boards came up in several ways. They're a very important part of advocacy for many organizations.
Definitely.
Oh, sorry, Hector.
Go ahead,
I was
Kristin.
just
No,
gonna
go
say,
ahead.
I would like cheer for that. I have said, if I had a penny every time I said volunteers are your number one advocates, number one. Yeah, that is one of our, that is on repeat in the why, is volunteers are your number one advocates.
Definitely. I also, just on the topic of boards, I feel what Heather was talking about is like educating the board and sort of bringing them up to speed and sharing, and that piece of the puzzle is so critical. And it's also why it's so important to have a board that's sort of receptive and sort of can see and is connected to the work that's happening on the front lines, that has an understanding of what the root causes are that necessitate, right, the services to begin with. And many of them, service boards in the organizations that we've worked with come from a variety of different backgrounds, but some of the strongest boards that sort of have really been big pushers of advocacy are usually people who have lived experience within the service spectrum that organization provides or other organizations provide. So they're bringing in their own perspective. They're like, we know what it's like to be on this side of the service sort of continuum. And when this conversation about advocacy is happening, it might already be happening internally at the board level. And, there are definitely barriers to how to engage, and definitely conversations and negotiations that have to happen around funding and capacity. But it's those conversations just happening altogether that are really valuable, again, to just get the shift started, even if it's just like 2% or even a 5% shift towards something that's like that. It doesn't always have to be, like I said before, this big battle. It can start really small in a way that makes sense and is comfortable for the organization and also the board.
Mm-hmm. We also encourage WISE to have public policy committees, so their boards will have then sort of whatever, it's a subcommittee to encourage those discussions and engagement, not just on issues impacting the why or members, but strengthening the entire community and taking this broader view. And I'll just put in a plug here. The why, about half our members are kids, youth. So youth voice is incredibly valuable for WISE, but also for helping legislators understand the needs of communities. The youth have firsthand experiences and perspectives that provide crucial insights. And at our National Advocacy Days, which we just hosted in March, we bring in a whole youth advocate program. And that is who, a lot of time, whether it's a member of Congress or your state legislator, who they really, you can just see the gravitation to hearing young people, talk about the issues in their engagement. And it also helps show who we are is the why, but the message that youth are bringing just adds so much more impact with our advocacy too. And it's great civic engagement and education, for the youth programs too. So it's been a real win for us in advocacy.
Great. I want to ask one more planned question before we go to audience Q&A. So again, audience, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. Kristin, you're part of Independent Sector's advisory group on prioritizing possible interventions and programming around helping nonprofits get involved and be more effective in advocacy. As part of that group, or drawing on your own experience, what do you see as the most promising possibilities for how we directly support nonprofits and their staff in getting more involved and lifting up voices?
Mm-hmm. There were so many great ideas and elements. One is, even if advocacy isn't called out in your mission, you can talk about it in your strategic plan for your organization. And how do you bring your mission, because advocacy is an integral part of our mission. And even if it's not called out, so when you're doing the strategic plan, how can advocacy really help you advance your mission too? So that is one. I think what I touched on earlier with just community impact, sometimes we call them community benefit statements, all fancy ways of saying a fact sheet. Can you get the numbers together, add stories, personal stories to that to really tell your story. But if there's one thing that I would really say that jumped out, it's the power of coalitions and working together. WISE come together at a state level to make state impact, but magnify that times 10 when we're with other nonprofit associations in those states, and then magnify times 100 when we're talking about all of the national coalitions that we work with. Everything we do, I referenced our legislative priorities, goes through the filter of what our partners are saying and asking for, to make sure that we're aligned. So truly, it's that we're better together.
Yeah, touching on that, the importance of nonprofit coalitions in advocacy. One of the things that we found that's really interesting is nonprofits spoke about coalitions as not only being somewhere where they could magnify their voices, as Kristin just said, but being somewhere where they learned about advocacy, where they learned about strategies, where they got new ideas. So I thought that was a really important function of coalitions that came out in our conversations.
Yeah, and it's also a time, we talked about one of the barriers Heather did from the study being time. It's also a way to really help knock down that barrier. If someone else is digging into all, it's a 1,000-page bill and someone's got to read through all of it, or, it really helps you with the time to setting those priorities together. And of course, the learnings. There's plenty of things we've missed in different states that another nonprofit group will pick up, that is important to the entire sector too.
Yeah, one organization we talked about how they learned to have a legislative tracker from one of their partner organizations, and that they found it really useful to keep hold of all of the different information that was impacting their organization. Just that little tool.
Independent sector will be sharing a legislative tracker any day now. It's in the works. So stay tuned for that. I want to switch to an audience question quick. It's sort of a multifaceted question. So this person asked about how we approach different levels of government, and also governments that may not be listening to us or may be hostile to us, right? So I think it's sort of a two-dimensional question, right? So are there different approaches to approaching executive, legislative, judicial, regulatory that you all would mention as particularly important? And then also, I guess sort of a separate question, but related and overlapping, how do you approach, again, like friendly versus more hostile audiences when you're doing advocacy? Like, are there different approaches in what works with those different audiences?
I can start. I might have missed the first question, but the friendly versus hostile, that's a really timely question for us, because at the National Advocacy Days we hosted last week, and that's also a barrier. You can be intimidated, right? You're afraid to go into an office that you think, especially if you're asking for money, whether it's an earmark or an increase. And, chronic disease prevention is one of our big things. The child care and development block grants, another one of our big legislative priorities. And this is an office that is supporting no increases. I think it is going in, sometimes you're asking for the same thing, but maybe your messaging, your talking points. So for childcare, which is, a huge issue, the biggest issue for us in many ways, is a workforce. Those arguments, like it's necessary for the economy. It is you need it. Working parents need quality, affordable childcare access. And so your end ask might be the same, but maybe you're making different points to get to that too. And I think also just confidence in the work that you're doing. You're sharing that information, and sometimes that is the goal itself. And it's as we always say, in the wise, like it's always a long game sometimes. And we had something called the Child Protection Improvement Act, 10 years in the making, and this has helped to improve like background checks that youth organizations can access. It can be a decade in the making, and even if you start in the beginning, it's could be making a difference in the long run.
Yeah, I think, Kristin, what you just mentioned, our people we spoke to talked about persistence, and they talked about how policies are forever, but people come and go. And we had one person, I remember this one story, they were trying to get legislation passed in their town, in their city about bike safety and bike lanes, et cetera, et cetera. And he talked about how they tried for years and years and years, and then there was an election and everything changed and they got everything they wanted. So he just talked about being ready to meet the moment when it arises.
Yeah.
Héctor, did you want to chime in before we talk about new topics?
Yeah, just really quick. This is a really important question. I feel that the answer varies greatly depending even by your geography. We've worked with an organization that's based in Alabama that works with immigrant communities. And one thing I remember was sort of the leader of that organization telling me that there is a level of compartmentalization that you have to do when you're in a city that's like, a blueberry and a tomato soup. And you have to sort of negotiate and navigate very hostile political environments, who in some cases, elected officials might go on the podium, on the dais and say horrible things about the people that you work with. But the next day, they might be shaking your hand and saying, thank you for the work that you're doing with this community. And it's just one of those nuances, right, that is just sort of critical and important to sort of bring up about how different organizations are navigating this space. And I think it's also important, like when you were talking about good relationships, bad relationships, it's important to assess as a provider or as a nonprofit, like where are these lawmakers or elected officials, people who have influence over your community and over your programming, where do they align with your work? Are they allies? Do you not know? Is it just completely sort of something that you won't need to investigate, or are they fully against sort of what you're about? And when it comes to sort of stepping up and pushing back against the different stakeholders who are against what you're for, right? Your social change work or your mission-driven sort of service-oriented work, coalitions are a really good tool for saying, hey, I can't take this sort of vocal approach, but I'm down to organize some of the constituents that I work with in the back end, and someone else takes sort of a public-facing sort of stance. Because the reality is, like, we have seen this in the past, organizations are scared of losing funding as a retaliation, or organizations have lost funding over advocacy, or even just putting out statements in support of different things that are happening. And it's important for us to really think about sort of what role you as a service provider have in sort of this sort of big work and advocacy as a whole, and also what other roles the community of organizations or network or ecosystem that you might have, what roles they can play so they can fill in those gaps that you can.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, I'm remembering the first part of the question too, different approaches if you're going local, state, federal, or executive branch. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about just one of the most basic advocacy tenets, which is just relationship building. Whatever level of government, that elected official wants to hear from someone who voted for them, a voter, constituent, who knows the community. And of course, you start building those relationships before you need something. So you can see the difference when I was just doing some of these congressional visits with WISE, the members of Congress who have been to that facility, seen what the Y is doing firsthand, knows somebody, who was on their board, or, all the points of connection. They went to school together, church together. It just starts with that very basic relationship building, and that cuts through every level of government too. So for us, we know, when we're going to Capitol Hill, those members of Congress don't want to hear from someone who's paid to do this advocacy too. They want to hear from a volunteer or a kid, as I mentioned, or a constituent who is actually helping them, meet needs in their community. And a photo op is always welcome.
This is all a great transition to a very related topic, which is I wanted to ask Heather about in the interviews in this report. I wanted you to talk to us a little bit more about relationships, right? And about how the leaders you interviewed saw relationships with government or with other significant actors.
Sure. Perhaps not surprisingly, and has been touched on already, most nonprofit managers we spoke to saw government relations primarily being about funding. They talked about how crucial government support was to their missions and the importance of relationships to safeguarding that funding. We had I remember this one conversation there, the woman told me we guard our relationships and we nurture our relationships. Because she said then at the right moment, at the right time, down the line, when you needed to make an ask, you already had that playing field to talk to the person about. At the same time, some nonprofits express frustration with government because their mission didn't exactly meet the funding criteria, and they felt as if they didn't have an opportunity to even get in the game. Or others talked about the really onerous process of applying for funding, and that they'd just rather spend their limited resources elsewhere. Another recurring theme that I talk about would be a real desire to have a seat at the table with government policymakers when the decisions are being made. There was a lot of expression of frustration about decisions being made and then there having to be pushback from nonprofits and ultimately things being resolved, but a lot of wasted time and a wasted effort. Whereas if they'd been at the table from the beginning with these relationships, that could have resolved a lot of wasted time and effort.
And Héctor and Kristin, the groups you work with and the branches you work with for the WISE, right? Those folks are working sort of constantly at the local and state levels, right? So, and I think relationships are maybe even more important when you get more local. So I wondered if you could share any strategies specifically for building those relationships, right, with local and state legislators, with others that matter, right, whether that be media, funders. There's a lot of entities out there that have influence and power, and so how do people specifically start to build those relationships?
One way is, especially with the barrier of time that we talked about, is taking stock of what you're already doing. For WISE, there's so many events, the start of summer camp, the Healthy Kids Day that we do, and starting with engaging elected officials or community leaders in the events that you're already doing. I mentioned photo ops before. We're lucky from an advocacy point of view that, the WISE just, when you're at a summer camp, there's so many great pictures there. We have a lot of food programs too for the WISE, helping bag groceries. So maybe it's a volunteer event that you could engage them in. And we talked about city council meetings. Sometimes it's just showing up, you're sitting there, it's a long meeting, but you're there to support an issue that might be before the city council. Or maybe there's not even, but you're going to see what you're just getting up to date on what the critical issues are. So it's also just showing up for those. And for the whys, one thing we're really trying to emphasize too is it's not just the job of the executive director or the CEO, but, you know, is your child care director engaged in a Head Start coalition in your community? How can you get your other staff levels engaged as well, and looking for those coalition opportunities too?
Yeah, everything that Kristin said, 100%. I also think, in particular to sort of human services, direct service organizations, is really thinking about, like, if we're thinking about strategies to build relationships in community with coalitions, with elected officials, it's having sort of tapping into, again, the strengths and expertise that these service providers have about the things that they do. They are the experts, and in many ways, they sometimes are the only sort of connecting point with the communities that are being impacted by unjust systems or harmful policies that are making their way down the pipe. And so when we think about, for instance, sort of traditional movement groups, organizing groups, grassroots organizations that sort of are leading the big charges on a lot of policy and advocacy work, or, you know, other different social change strategies. One of the things that we're really interested in telling, or we make a point of telling the organizations that we're working with, is to see social change not as separate from service work. And in messaging with different movement groups, sort of trying to build those relationships by saying, like, hey, like, we developed some social change priorities. We had some questions about how to engage in developing the leadership of the people that we work with. We have no skills or knowledge on how to move people from a program participant to a position of leadership and sort of being able to develop a story of self. Organizers do that every day. And if you're building sort of that connection, that's just one way of, again, just sharing resources, relationship building, education and skills development, all that really interesting, all that really useful stuff. But on the other side of that, I think it's really important. I mean, as we're talking about, you know, advocacy and the people who do it a lot, it's important for advocacy groups and movement groups to really think about how to integrate service organizations in a way that makes sense for them, because too many times I've heard from the people we work with that they are seen as sort of the Band-Aid or not part of the movement, or they don't have social change potential because they're engaged in services, right? Whereas, like, the movement groups see themselves as sort of the only ones. And I think it's important we start sort of bridging that, because those kinds of connections and relationships are so powerful, right? And can make a huge change in the communities that you're working with. Some of those relationships do take time to build out, but it has to start somewhere, right?
I could just add quickly to that, Kevin, and Hector, thank you for that, because it made me think of an example, because that is so true. The policy and program, I think, have been seen as very separate things sometimes within, I'll just speak for the why, but an example of that where we're really trying to show that they're very integrated is WISE are well known for our swim lessons, but we also do a lot with drowning prevention and all the legislation around drowning prevention. It's funding, it's all that. So it's making sure aquatic staff and those, like, understands the drowning prevention and all of the policy side of that too. And you can go through any other program and there's an advocacy component to that as well.
Great, thanks so much. I want to touch on a topic that's already come up that's planned before we switch over to audience Q&A again. So I want to touch on coalitions again, because they are so effective and so important. So first I wanted to plug the independent sector has a new project called our Coalition Connection, which is built around collecting information about existing coalitions, advocacy coalitions, to connect organizations to coalitions so they can find coalitions working on the issues they want to work on. But then my question for the panel is around things, what coalitions do, and in particular, the action of coalitions around nonpartisan and bipartisan strategies in a hyperpartisan environment, like Heather said, right? So what do you all see as examples or models of nonpartisan or bipartisan action or collaboration that you would highlight right now? Are there issues where a nonpartisan or bipartisan approach are more or less effective right now? Essentially, just I think if you can say more about how coalitions act and strategies that are effective, I think that could be helpful.
I have an example from yesterday. Our CEO of YMCA of the USA was with, I think it was 8 other CEOs of some of the largest nonprofits in the country. And they spent the entire day, one half of the day on the House side, one half of the day on the Senate side, talking about the Charitable Act and how to help promote that, advance that, which would benefit every single nonprofit. So that's a federal example.
Right. Advocacy for the sector and not for a specific issue.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else, Héctor?
I mean, something that we're seeing because of this current sort of administration's policy and legislative movements has been the reactivation of many different networks that existed before 2020 in 2016, right? As a response to sort of the attacks and sort of the fear that's been impacting immigrant communities all over the country. These different networks are an example of just how effective sort of organization and coalition building is, because you might be sort of an immigration service provider who is there just to provide legal aid and help people navigate sort of this, either it could be an asylum case or anything else. But when you're working with different organizations, different groups, you're able to resource share and make more abundant the resources and information around what are the rights that immigrants have in these times. What are the things that we can look out for? How can we avert crises from happening by doing so? And also, as networks are sort of restarting in this moment, what do we do when crisis does happen, right? How do we respond? What's our messaging? How do we organize around it? How do we get people out of places of harm as different organizations in a community when we see a community member being taken away? I think these are sort of examples of just how responsive community coalitions can be to these moments. And in many ways, similar to what happened in 2020, where the government couldn't fill in the gaps for distributing COVID resources, vaccines, tests, all that good stuff. Coalitions were made around healthcare and prevention, and those relationships, many of them still exist to this day because how have we not been working together before? You all are really good at this. You all are really good at that. Like, how can we keep this going? And what we're seeing now is, a sort of so many years into the future of, again, relationships being built and sort of this trust that's been generated across different networks and communities, which again is in many ways, it can be like a life-saving sort of resource for community members who are the most vulnerable, especially today.
Thank you all for that. I want to tackle, hopefully we have time to tackle 2 related audience questions. So one is on permissible advocacy activities for 501c3s, which I think all of us have probably gotten that question at some point or another. And then the other is related, and specifically about whether or not there are trainings specific to other types of organizations that maybe not 501c3s, like private foundations or grant makers, if there are resources around what those types of organizations are legally permitted to do. So a question about 501c3s, and then also a question about grant makers in particular. Again, general knowledge or resources that people would point people to. And then we'll wrap up after that.
Really quickly, I think just one of my favorite resources, and it's actually one of the ones that I personally tapped into when I was a case manager and wanted to do some sort of advocacy and engagement at the city level where I was working in San Francisco. And it's Boulder Advocacy and Alliance for Justice. They do a ton, they have a ton of resources on their website. And they also provide trainings, I think, for all sort of different people of levels of the organization. And also, I think just one important thing to note about is the sort of this question about sort of what organizations are able to do and what they're not able to do is important to be clear on. That this confusion and sort of even misinformation that exists out there is a method of breaking up the power that service providers and organizations have. That is by design. There are different ways that organizations can engage with, but for so long, you know, again, misinformation exists out there that really holds the hands of organizations together and unable to feel like they can make a change. But there's really so much that organizations can do through legally that does not, you know, break any sort of rules or anything like that. However, to the right now, because of the current sort of political dynamics that we're seeing, the very mission of service organizations is being criminalized. Supporting immigrant communities, supporting Muslim organizations, or Muslim communities, those are being targeted right now. And it's important to know that building sort of that community power, getting understanding, having the resources either from philanthropy or others to have sort of legal supports for those organizations during these times is essential so that they can navigate things and protect themselves as much as they can.
Thanks for that. We have 2 minutes, Jeff. I would love if you could wrap us up quick.
Very quickly. So I would double click on what Héctor just shared, right, about confusion leads to chilling, right? Confusion around the rules can be used, I think was also the point that he was making, to chill the voice. So all the more reason why we need to be smart about what is and is not permissible, and you have a role to play, right? And you have space to play. So that's one thing to leave everybody with. I obviously want to thank the speakers. I also will quickly mention a couple of themes, right? So use your boards, right? They are one of the best instruments that you have. They also need to be educated, and they want to be educated. And I love whoever made the point about make sure your board has a policy committee, because that helps to build muscle and awareness and comfort. Secondly, the power of coalitions. We've talked a lot about this, and a couple of words keep reverberating in my mind around the power of coalitions, right? It's an opportunity to leverage. It's an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to amplify your voice. It is also an opportunity to provide some level of comfort as I come into the space, right? And may also give me a level of comfort in terms of distance, right? Being able to use a coalition when, you know, trying to get a point across to an audience that may be less friendly. That takes me to the last point around how we approach audiences that may be more hostile to a message in a given time. Be confident in the story that you have to tell. That really matters. Make sure you're working from a relationship. And I love whoever it was said, policies are forever, or maybe almost forever, but people come and go. Right? So play a long game. Advocacy is not about an immediate win. It's wonderful when it is, but it is a long game. Thank you all very much. Please do respond to the survey that is in the chat. It is really important for us to know how this landed with you all. It makes our effort to do these kinds of webinars in the future better. So please do take a moment with the survey. Once again, to Heather, Héctor, Kristin, and to Kevin, of course, and the rest of the team that's off camera, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.